Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. In the first 2 months of 2022, 6 journalists were killed in Mexico. The high number of journalist killings over the past decade and a half has made the country the most dangerous place to be a journalist. Non-governmental organizations such as Article 19 and the Committee to Protect Journalists have sounded the alarm and called the government to take action. Journalists covering crime and corruption face great risks, and the links between organized criminal organizations and politicians, as well as other local authorities, make the situation even more dangerous. At the same time, Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, continues to paint the press as puppets or as members of the opposition, and went so far as to call them mercenaries. To talk more about the dangers of being a journalist in Mexico, as well as the mechanisms in place to protect journalists and the relationship between López Obrador and the media, I met with Peniley Ramírez. Peniley Ramírez is an investigative journalist and columnist for the newspaper Reforma, whose work focuses on corruption. She previously worked as a correspondent for Univision's investigative unit. Her book, Los Millonarios de la Guerra, examines who were the financial winners of Mexico's war on drugs. Here's my conversation with Peniley Ramírez. Peniley Ramírez, investigative journalist, columnist at the newspaper Reforma, and author of the book Los Millonarios de la Guerra. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
Thank you, and greetings to everybody.
So for this episode, I wanted to talk about doing journalism in Mexico in light of the recent and numerous journalist killings in the past couple of months. We were going to originally record this last week on Thursday, and since then, actually, on that very same day, a 6th journalist was killed. So in other words, so far in 2022, and we're only 2 months in, 5 journalists have been killed for doing their work. But in the last 15 years or so, the number of journalists killed has risen to an alarming point. According to the UNESCO Observatory, there were 9 journalists killed in 2010 and 2011, and 13 journalists killed each year from 2016 to 2018. And so Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist. What can you tell us about this trends, and why is it so dangerous to be a journalist in Mexico?
Well, we can divide the violence against journalists in Mexico into different kinds of violences. The worst, of course, is the killings of journalists in Mexico, the killings of journalists for doing their work, so for being holding accountable politicians, local politicians, and business people and drug smugglers. So people is killed in Mexico for telling the stories that need to be told. So that's one of the things that's happening. It's really awful that they are killed, and as more than 95% in some cases of the cases of murders in Mexico, these killings, most of them has remained in impunity. So most of these cases haven't been resolved. Some just high-profile cases have had, a resolution, a proper investigation, but most of the cases remains in impunity. So this allows us to wonder, who are the journalists? The majority of the journalists that have been killed aren't famous. They are not based in Mexico City. They don't work for international news wires of international news media. They work in small cities and small towns, working for really small organizations with a really small budget. Most of them are from racial minorities. Most of them are poor. Most of them are sometimes having other jobs to afford being journalists. So some of them have been, working as taxi drivers at the same time they are working as journalists. So most of them are trying to get money for living and be able to work as journalists because that's their passion, their vocation. So the thing is that it's important when we analyze who are and why this people is killed, our colleagues, it's who are them. So I think it's one of the, of the bottom lines that we don't mention that often as we should do, which is, who are these journalists? Well, in what conditions they were, performing the work before their killings, and what happened after the killings. So in most of these cases, as I said, we don't have justice. We don't know what happened exactly. And in a lot of cases, their killings becomes a tragedy for the entire family. Most of those families has to move to another city, sometimes to another country. Most of the people killed are men. The journalists killed in Mexico since 2000 are men. So in most cases, you have an entire family that were economically dependent of that person that has to do something else to survive economically. So if we have to analyze, the tragedy of what's happening in Mexico with the press, we should take into account all these factors. Who are them? What kind of stories they were telling? What happened? And what happens after their killings with the case, and with their families, and with their colleagues? Because every time a journalist is killed in a city or a town, every other journalist, every one of their colleagues have this feeling of, I'm going to be the next, or I could be the next, or I can be the next. So this hazardous conditions of working every day in fearing that I could be the next person killed. It's something that we don't talk about it that often, but it happens every time. I have done reporting on the ground in Mexico, in some places where several of my colleagues have been killed. And when you talk to the journalists, that working there after the killing of a colleague, they are having such a bad time. They are feeling insecure. They are paranoid. Some of them need psychological help, because they have to remain reporting on the same things, on the same violence. And this brings me to the second point, which is, I think, is really important too, about what's been a journalist in Mexico these days. It's not just the fact that you can, you see that your colleagues are being killed and nothing happens about the cases in most of the journalists killed, but also you are working with this fear of, I could be the next, but also you are working on this under really precarious conditions in most of the cases. So you have a really low salary. You have to work for several news media in order to put all your salaries together and try to make, enough for living for you and your family. So you are under a lot of stress. You have to report a lot of stories. Some of my colleagues are working simultaneously for 4 different news media, 5 different news media, or they need to work, as I said before, doing their journalistic work and doing some other job not related to make enough money for living. So you have to do all of this, all of this, work stress. It's added to the fact that you are in fear all the time, most of the time. And at the same time, the kind of stories you are reporting are more of that violence. So you are not prepared to be reporting violence as war violence, kind of war violence, but without being a war correspondent. So you are not prepared psychological. You don't have proper equipment, like formal equipment. And you don't have, of course, any previous training on how to deal with this after you're done with the story. Because you have to do it again the same day, the next day, and the next day. You have to do it over and over again. So one of the things that have happened to the journalists in Mexico is that there is a beautiful net of journalists right now, and so they have been receiving some trainings to try to separate their personal life with the professional life, to try to know what to do if you are in the middle of a shooting and you are reporting. But that's not enough. So the journalists and, the nonprofits organizations who are, journalists that has some kind of journalist advocacy, they are helping us for these trainings. But what's about the government? How the government is, taking into account that they're not protecting the lives of the journalists, but they're not also protecting, the integrity, work and personal and psychological integrity of all of these journalists. And sometimes it happens because many of the attacks comes from the government, from the federal government and from the local government. So it's really a really complex situation. It's not just one kind of violence. It's several kind of violence. And the worst case, of course, are all those cases that we don't know what happened actually.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the mechanisms that the government has to protect journalists. Since you, as you said, the Undersecretary of the Interior, Alejandro Encinas, said in December that more than 90% of these cases go unpunished. There seem to be some mechanisms that over the years the Mexican government has implemented to some extent, maybe in the federal government, but not with local governments, not in conjunction with local governments. And according to Reporters Without Borders, these mechanisms are also severely understaffed for the number of journalists that have asked for protection, or it takes too long to get that protection, and by the time that happens, some journalists have been killed.
Yeah, so it depends on who is in lead. Who is the governor or who is the president. So with this mechanism, we have, as you said, some better moments and some really bad moments. I think in general, if the mechanism is properly, how can I say this? If the mechanism is properly put into work, so if it's properly implemented, it's better. It's better to have, somebody taking care of you, somebody like a personal guard. That's kind of a solution, but it doesn't solve the problem in fact. So you are now, if you are under the mechanism, in the best of the cases, you have a police officer going with you to everywhere, even if you are doing, your shopping, or you are taking your kid to school. That police officer is always with you all the time. There are, if you are in your newsroom working, that person is going to be out of there waiting for you. If you're in your house, that person is going to be out of there waiting for you, and you will have cameras in your house. So what kind of living is that? How can you live with that? So you get used to it, but it's not a way of raising your kids, of conducting your job, of meeting with your sources, with a police officer in the next table or outside of the restaurant or wherever you're meeting your source. So this is the best case. But so many other cases, so many other journalists don't even have this, don't even have, the access of a person, looking for you all the time, helping you to move around the city without feeling that you can be, killed at any moment. So as you said, coordination between governors or government from states and the federal government has been an issue for several years now. And also every time, we have seen this in the last 3 years with the federal government, every time we have a new federal government, they feel that they have to solve it. So they try to implement a new strategy, and they say that they will be the one who will solve it. And sometimes you have people, the government is not monolithic. There are some people in every government. I think even if a leftist government of people, that are more conservative, maybe, but all of them could have people, that really care about the problem, that really want to solve the problem. But the problem for me is that if your mechanism depends on, what's happening with the current government, so who is in charge, what is this people ideas, you will have what you have here in this case, which is sometimes it's better sometimes it's worse. Sometimes you have a better government that, has more people that really care about it. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have more budget and sometimes you don't. So this instability I think is part of the reason why we have seen, better years, some years with more cases, some years with less cases. And I think right now we're in the really hard moment for the press, as we have had in previous governments, because added to all of this that we have talked so far, we have also a federal government with a president that holds a press conference every day, and half of those conferences is him complaining about things that he doesn't like. So he doesn't like certain people, he doesn't like certain journalists, so he doesn't like to be held accountable for the things that he does and he says. So this has, this has been a tool for more violence in the social networks, violence in the digital space, which has been, reported recently, and violence from dividing the country between the past and the present. So everything in the perspective of the current Mexican government, everything from the past, you can critique that, but you can't critique anything from the present, because everything from the past comes from neoliberalism governments, which is true, but they were the bad people. They were the bad people for everything, including with the press. And right now, whatever the person from the president himself and his party does, it's kind of justified because they say they are doing a transformation for the country. So the thing is that anything that you report today that you are criticizing some of the government decisions of the government contracts or whatever comes from this government could be targeted for new violence, physical violence, digital violence, and violence coming from the president himself.
Yeah. In fact, my next question was about AMLO's relationship with the media, because, as you said, he creates situations where, there's two groups. It's him, the people, the government, and on the other side, the neoliberal governments, the corrupt ones, and the media, right? Like he paints them as opposition to him and his government. And whenever he's criticized, he always says, well, those who were in power before were the corrupt ones. We're not. And he has referred to journalists as mercenaries. This happened when journalists were covering the scandal of his son's house in Houston. You wrote a column about it, very good column. I enjoyed reading it. But, instead of addressing the issues that he was being criticized for, or the government was being criticized for, he upped his rhetoric. He engaged in something that I think it goes against the government saying they're trying to protect journalists, right? So it seems like it puts this in a very difficult position. I think this also appears to be now an issue, maybe a little bit of the binational relationship between Mexico and the United States, because Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted a few days ago that, quote, the high number of journalists killed in Mexico this year and the ongoing threats they face are concerning. Can you tell me a little bit about the response from the Mexican president to these comments? Because I think it is very typical of him, I would say. But
well, to give you a little context, like how we got here, one nonprofit in Mexico named Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, so Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, and a news media named Latinos published a long article saying that the son of the son of the president was living for a year between 2019 and 2020 in a really fancy house near to the Woodlands in Texas. And that house belonged to a former high executive of Baker Hughes, which is this large service petroleum company that has been hired for 60 years by the Mexican government. What we published in Reforma, where I write my column, is that AMLO's son and his wife were living in while they were living in this house near the Woodlands. This company was making almost $350 million in contracts with Pemex. So the president was really mad about it. He took the CEO of Pemex to his daily conference. The CEO of Pemex said in that daily conference that I didn't know anything about Pemex contracts, that I didn't understand a thing, and that contracts were justified. So it has been a really big controversy around this. Then the company said that they hired an external law firm, and these people did an investigation in 3 weeks, about 3 or 4 weeks, and they concluded that everything was okay. There was no conflict of interest. So that case is ongoing, still ongoing. But at the same time, the president it's important to say that before coming into the presidency of Mexico, and even in his first year, he said that he will never try to defend his family, that any person, even his family, that commit anything illegal has to, respond for his own acts. And he will only respond for his youngest son, which is now, I think, is in secondary school. So he said that before, but now that this scandal came up, he said that there were journalists and politicians from the opposition behind those journalists, and they were trying to damage his government. So his position has been like, it's not my son's action, it's some bad people trying to take my government down, and these people are the ones that are doing this. So again, it's not a journalistic work, it's journalists seen as puppies, as tools of these other politicians, according to him. So he has been pushing against the journalists, not that much about me. He said the CEO thing, that he took the CEO of Pemex to respond to my column, but he has been really tough on Carlos Loret de Mola, which is a really famous Mexican journalist that he's the head of one of the news media that published this story. So he's been targeting him. He published a slide in the daily conference trying to say that an anonymous person brought him a piece of paper saying how much this journalist was making for a year. So he didn't even explain how he had that information. He said that was this anonymous source, which is, hard to believe if you're talking about a president. But he said that this journalist has to give explanations about his salaries, and which is crazy because this journalist is a private person that doesn't work for the government, so doesn't have government contracts or anything. But he was pushing with this, and then the government of the United States responded in different levels. So they first responded with a tweet with the Secretary of State, Blinken, saying that we are really concerned about what's happening with the press in Mexico, the killings of journalists, and the situation in general. Then the press officers for the White House. And before that, some politicians, Republican politicians, especially from Texas. So different parts of the American political spectrum have responded to this. And the response from the Mexican government and from the president López Obrador himself has been every time that you don't know what's happening, don't intervene in our sovereignty in our country. But even if the White House has said that they are worried about that, his response has been once and again, don't mess with us, it's our problem, it's our country, it's our press. But I think, first, I think it's really important that you have somebody out of the country with that kind of power, like political power, saying that we we are looking at what's happening, because some other nonprofits have said that, Article 19 has been a really great tool for the journalists in Mexico to know what's happening, to held accountable to a lot of politicians. But they are nonprofits, they are not governments. So the fact that the U.S. government has responded to this, it's been having like a dual interpretation in Mexico. Some people think, really good, because, it's going to have, external pressure the Mexican government to try to act differently. But at the same time, some people in Mexico are saying that they don't have the right to do that kind of statements about what's happening in our country. So we have this polarization in this case, and we have this polarization in almost every case that we are reporting these days. So it's really hard, because you are dealing with the violence, the physical violence, you are dealing with the economical violence, but dealing with the digital violence, and you are dealing with all this political violence. At the end, we, the journalists, I think it's important that we say that we are not politicians. We're not part of this equation. We are not from the right or from the left. We can have, our own political ideas, each of us, but we are not there for a political battle. We are there to report the facts and to investigate the facts and to hold accountable to all the people with power that can interfere or have any intervention in others' people's lives. So the thing is that we have been, I think with today's, the journalists in Mexico are trapped in the middle of this battle that is not related directly to us. And I think it's important to say that some people, as myself, we are privileged, because you can work, from out of Mexico. I am living in New York right now. But even when I was living in Mexico City, it was a safer place than working, from Tijuana, or working from Nuevo Laredo, or working from Veracruz, or working from Michoacán. So even inside of Mexico, you have different kinds and levels of danger. And I think we should, in every opportunity, as this opportunity, it's important to mention and to repeat that those journalists in those places where they have less attention, less international attention, less money to work, less money to make, a living from their work, and local politicians, local drug smugglers, local business people has a lot of power, to damage them. And we must say that every time we are asked about what's happened with the press in Mexico, I think we should say that those journalists in those places of Mexico, without all this international attention, are in the greater dangers.
Peniley Ramírez, investigative journalist and columnist, thank you so much for answering these questions, and thank you for your own journalistic work as well.
Well, thanks so much.
That was Peniley Ramírez. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the Judy Lay Allen Mexico Center podcast. Thanks to Lisa Huacata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Special thanks to Judy Lay Allen for her generous support of the work we do at the center. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada, and I will see you next time.